Hello, everyone. Today we have Mr. Ramesh Abhishek, who is joining us to give us a brief recording on the recent report released by the RBI. This report talks about the fiscal health of states and discusses some concerning states in the light of the fiscal crisis that Sri Lanka is in. Thank you for coming today, sir, and we are glad to have you here.
Yeah. No, thank you, Yashoroop, for inviting me. It's good to be here.
Thank you, sir. And without any further ado, I'll just jump into the first question, and we can maybe have a discussion on this as well. Firstly, sir, as the RBI paper says, it refers to cash subsidies and provision of free utility services as swords of Damocles. However, in a country like India, which is still at such a nascent developing stage, the government has to be primarily responsible for ensuring universal access to services that are vital for social development. Given this, so what do you think? What should policymakers do to strike a balance between social development and public debt sustainability?
Yashoroop, I think we need to look at this issue from a very overall broader perspective that the role of state to protect the vulnerable sections of society is not under question. That is a very fundamental duty of the state, absolutely. And I don't think RBI or central government or any government will have two opinions on that. Now, the question is what is the best way of protecting the vulnerable sections? That is the only question that should face the policymakers and regulators. Now, if you look at the kind of interventions that the governments do to protect the vulnerable sections, those are fairly wide ranging actually. And so the question also arises as to what are the interventions that are not helping the vulnerable sections so much, but they are creating other problems and issues. For example, when the state government gives free electricity and free water, then it creates an incentive to not conserve, to waste. And also, then farmers can grow water guzzling crops, which is detrimental to the overall water management in that area. And for example, a policy on procurement, for example, you are procuring at very high rates. Again, you are giving the same food grain sometime at a very low rate, 2 rupees kilo and all. So again, these market forces also need to be operational in many of these issues. If you want, I think governments need to help the poor sections by identifying the really vulnerable ones. Because if the government is are going to give subsidies of various kinds to 60, 70, 80% of the population, then obviously there is something wrong with that strategy. The really vulnerable sections should not be more than 20 or 25%, the really vulnerable. You're giving them direct cash subsidies, direct transfer to them to help them tide over various issues and problems could be a better idea, which doesn't come in the way of operation of market forces, which doesn't encourage corruption and wasteful consumption and lot of other distortions. So I think the governments need to be mindful of supporting the most vulnerable in a manner that is corruption free and hassle free and doesn't create distortions.
Okay, sir. Okay, thank you for that, sir. And sir, so taking from that, a big part of what the government spends when it comes to the vulnerable sections is on power, and we have seen, and the report also suggests the same, that bailing out these power distribution companies every other year or every few years or so is a huge financial burden on some state governments. So, what are your opinion, and why do you think this happens? And what are some steps that could be taken to make power distribution or the power sector more financially sustainable?
Yashwarup, I have been of the view always that this cross subsidization in power sector and even in railways for that matter are very detrimental to the economy in general, exchequers. Because when you are giving free or very subsidized electricity to some sections of society, you are also putting that burden on other sections, for example, industry and commercial establishments, which actually really affects their competitiveness. Businesses are not competitive, then obviously in a global integrated market, it's very difficult to compete against cheap goods coming from some countries. So I think to maintain the competitiveness of our businesses, these cross subsidies in power sector are very, very totally avoidable. And of course, it, as we discussed, it also encourages wasteful consumption and lot of other attendant problems with it. And of course, it seriously affects the state exchequers. So I think electricity free cross subsidization should be avoided. Those who are really poor, as I said, they should be given direct help to pay for their electricity, which they can with that help that they get. And same thing goes for railways, for example. You know, the railway passenger tickets are so cheap, and the burden of that subsidy falls on the freight movement, which again makes it very expensive, and again businesses become uncompetitive. So I think there is a need to look at all kind of subsidies that the governments provide, not only state governments but also central government. And this is really a very opportune time, the RBI report and the Supreme Court decision, to relook public policies in all these spheres and then try to get away from those traditional mistakes that we have done and focus on protecting the vulnerable, really vulnerable sections with direct transfers.
Okay, thank you for that, sir. And just to wrap up, could you? So, a lot of these discussions on state spending and the kind of things that a state is supposed to spend on the so-called non-merit goods, etc., relies heavily on general consensus within the decision makers in the state. There is a degree of politics involved as well as a degree of public opinion involved. What are some ways, sir, in which you think we can achieve a general consensus or a situation where there is a healthy discussion on the kind of spending that states must undertake?
So, Yashoroop, what happens as we know in practice is one or other political party makes these promises and they give these kind of subsidies, and that puts pressure on other political parties to make similar promises and maybe outdo the other one. So what happens ultimately is that there's a race to the bottom virtually. So far the public finances are concerned and the priorities of the governments are concerned. So to address this problem, I think there has to be a broad consensus among all major political parties of the country, if not all, that what should be done and what should not be done. What are the areas on which they will, vulnerable sections need to be protected in what manner, and secondly, what are the areas in which it is prudent not to indulge in giving those so-called freebies. So I think this healthy discussion is required and a broad agreement required. Then only this very bad competition that has set in many parts of the country will get addressed, and this huge problem of race to the bottom will also stop.
Thank you, sir. It's been an enlightening discussion, and I think our viewers would love to get the insights from this conversation.